Welcome everyone to the CNS Summit 2020 keynotes. I'm very pleased today to have Kelly and Christine with me to kick off a series of conversations around the patient experience. Clearly, this is a topic that we could talk about for months on end, and this is what we're going to do. So this is just the first of a series of conversations, bringing in various patients, industry experts to think about how we're doing as an industry around the patient experience. Now, Kelly, let me start with you. So Kelly McKee, currently, I believe you are at Medidata, is that correct?
I am, yep.
Yes, and I think you recently started there, but you've been in the industry for many years, focused on improving the patient experience, is that right?
It is, yeah,
Okay.
20 years.
Okay.
And
I started really early.
Yeah. I started off as a CRA and then was a project manager. And then about 12 years ago, I switched over to patient recruitment, and I've been doing that ever since. And I've become passionate about the value that participants bring to making new medicines possible, and really believe that we need to celebrate their contributions.
So all those years, what kinds of initiatives were you working on? I know it's across different companies, but can you give some examples of things you were doing to improve the patient experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So running things like trial simulations where we bring in real patients, real sites, real doctors, study coordinators into a room with the physicians that are in charge of the protocol, and run through the study to see if it works, to see if there's anything that we can do operationally to make things better. Incorporating choice into clinical trials. So by that, I mean designing a trial so a patient gets to choose if she wants to go to the site or wants to have a home visit or a virtual visit. And then really working on improving communications to patients. There are so many really, really, really bad advertisements for clinical trials that drive me crazy. And I think we can really improve them. And people say, oh, but it costs so much money. It doesn't. So it's just about changing your mindset around the way that we correspond with patients.
So those are really good examples you gave, and I'm sad to say that they're actually quite progressive to compare to what industry was doing only a few years ago. I mean, how do you think across the industry we're doing with that? Do you see a kind of a huge difference between different companies? How do you see the evolution of us thinking about those issues, which really, frankly, when you started, I'm sure we weren't doing at all well on?
Well, I'd like to say that we're getting better, and maybe we are as a whole, but we are still light years behind where we need to be. If you look outside of clinical trials, the experience of individuals is so much better. And, look at Amazon or Nike or Disney. It's all about the experience. And we need to make clinical trials all about the experience of the patient. And we just haven't done that. We haven't done a good job of it.
So we'll come back to that as we bring Christine into a conversation. I think Christine has years of experience as a patient to talk to us about. Now, for you, Kelly, I know that recently, after many years of being on the sort of industry side, you decided to volunteer as a clinical trial participant. I believe you're in a clinical trial right now. Is that correct?
I am, yes. So with the pandemic and the advent of vaccine trials, I decided that it was my time. It was my time to raise my hand and say that I want to be part of the solution. And believe it or not, it wasn't easy for me to get into the clinical trial. I had to do a lot of research and then find out who the doctor was running the studies at the hospital near me. I had to call my friends who are physicians at that hospital to try to get me in. And I know more about clinical trials than 99% of the population. If it's hard for me to get into a trial, imagine what it's like for somebody who doesn't know about clinical trials or maybe has a bad thought about clinical trials.
Yeah, it's interesting. I talked to a lot of people who knew there were COVID vaccine trials going on and had no clue how to actually access them, right? Some of them within our industry, right? And I think we'll come back a bit more about what your experience has been like, but I'd like to start with Christine on her sort of very long journey. I believe, Christine, you first had to interact with the healthcare system at a very young age. How old were you?
So I was very young. My very first opportunity to interact, as you say, was at 5 years old with a surgery. From then on, things continued. At 14, I was diagnosed with a rare blood condition. 28, I was diagnosed with lupus. And as the years continued, multiple other diagnoses, rare conditions, and autoimmune. I was, at the age of 14, studied by Stanford with the rare disease, and actually have a little certificate, I wish I had it with me, that said, thank you for my contribution to medical research. And that was dated 1989. So that was my first interaction. And I'll tell you, it hasn't been a fun one going forward.
So, you know, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be exploring many topics within the series, but something Kelly said earlier was she mentioned some brands, including Amazon. I will say that at the same time this will go out, we'll also be having a conversation with Shez Partovi, head of life sciences and healthcare at Amazon. And certainly in that conversation, I was very interested to ask Shez about what Amazon calls the customer obsession, right? And what I said in that interview, I asked him about the fact that he's a physician too. And I said, I don't think anyone really would accuse the healthcare system nor the clinical trial system of necessarily being customer obsessed if that customer is the patient, right? So coming to that theme, I'd like to kind of ask both of you to share some of your experiences around this and really think about, was that in any way customer obsessed? You know, and what could have been done better? So maybe, Kelly, you have a much shorter history of interacting on the clinical trial stuff. So maybe we'll start with you. Tell us about anything you want to tell us, really, about what your experience has been like. You explained how hard it was to get in. So take up the story there. Like, what's been your experience like?
So, my experience has been really great in the fact that I feel like I'm doing something really good for humanity. So just, you know, let it be known that I'm really happy with my decision, and I know that I'm part of the solution that we're all so desperately wanting and needing. Yeah. With that being said, there were a lot of things that the study team could have done better to improve my experience as a patient. And I actually brought some things. So
Kelly, before you get going, did you share with them that you knew something about clinical trials and what your work is? Did they know?
Yes, I
Okay.
told them. Yeah.
Okay. So theoretically, knowing that, they might, for various reasons, even be treating you with white gloves, maybe compared to one might expect, right?
Well, you know, I do have to say that the staff at the hospital are really, really great. And I think that they're treating all the patients very equally.
Okay, great.
But I received this baggie right here. And this is all of the stuff that I got. Okay. And if you think about the science behind the vaccines, it's like Star Trek. It's super, super cool. I'm going to show you something that's not. This thermometer, when do you think this is from? 1992?
It's not this year, that's for sure.
Right. So if you think about the science and the innovation that went into developing the medicine, why aren't we taking that approach too with the patients? Why is it okay to send a card with when to call the doctor where they've added things on here in handwriting? It's not. And so people may say, well, you're still getting the information to the patient, but it doesn't make me feel special. It doesn't make me feel like I'm a valued member of, you know, society working to end this pandemic. And it's these little things that really are additive, and they just add up to either making or breaking your clinical trial experience.
Do you think that certainly for the COVID trials, I'm sure more than ever, I mean, whenever any clinical trial is run, nobody's trying to slow down the clinical trial, right? Everyone's looking at enrollment. So I'm sure that's even more extreme with the COVID trials. Do you think some of that might be due just to the time pressures people have, or what do you think?
Absolutely. Time pressures play into that. But why is it that the patient experience it's okay to cut corners? They're not cutting corners at the labs. They're not cutting corners with data management, but yet it's okay to just throw things together for a patient. I think that the patient experience really needs to be thought of as so important that we can't cut those corners.
So with your experience of the work you've done that you described briefly earlier, how would you have reimagined that? What would you like to have experienced?
Well, a nicer thermometer that didn't take 2 minutes and 37 seconds to read my temperature every time I took it, which I had to take it for a long time following each vaccination. And then just, I don't know, maybe a nice folder instead of a plastic bag, maybe materials that didn't look like they had been slapped together by fifth graders. I mean, these things aren't hard.
And how did you find, you said it was hard to get into the trial. Was there any other aspect of your visits or anything else that you think was not particularly patient friendly?
Well, I received my patient stipend on 2 different CLIN cards because the systems weren't ready. So that was a pain, but at least I got a visit stipend. Many don't. The hospital that I go to is not in the best part of town, but that's not the fault of the pharmaceutical company or the hospital. And my second visit, they didn't think that all the patients would be coming in, and they overbooked. So there were 2 slots available and 30 patients came in. And it was just like scrambling, trying to get us all in and out. So it didn't feel that unique and personalized and,
Okay, so it's pretty chaotic from your point of view. Okay, so Christine, I mean, you, I know, have many, many stories, so we could spend 7 hours just on one of them. In general, what has been your experience in the context of what we're talking about, which is, Amazon tries to be customer obsessed. We're clearly not that, but what have you experienced and what observations have you had of if you were in charge with a magic wand that you would make different, whether in healthcare or clinical research?
So first, Kelly, I want to thank you for participating in a trial and for sharing that it is a positive experience, because I do think that one of the things that we have an issue with is just the definition of clinical trials in general and what people view a clinical trial as. And Kelly, you brought up a great point that you are doing your part and you're helping people. But I think from the patient side of it, they're looking at it as this is my last chance, And so there's a little bit of a different perspective. So what I think people need to consider is that these are people that we're working with. They're not numbers. They're not data points. These are actual people who are giving you literally their blood, sweat, and tears, or injecting something into their body. And we're asking them to do these things that could give side effects and not really even giving them a reason to why they're doing this, right? I think that most people, when they're doing a clinical trial, are looking at it as an option for themselves. They're not looking at the greater good of what this trial could do for other people. So I think magic wand, first thing, reframe clinical trials into a more positive spin, right? Tell people that by participating in a clinical trial, you are doing something amazing.
Quite a few surveys show that altruism is actually a big driver for patients. That's surveys I've certainly seen, so it's kind of interesting.
Yeah. But I don't know, it kind of depends on who's doing those surveys, right? If you get down into the barrel and you're talking to the patients, a lot of them don't want to do it, right? They don't know about clinical trials. They don't know about placebos. I think there's just a lot of misinformation out there. I think another thing that was difficult as a patient is to actually, like Kelly said, find clinical trials. So when I first started, I had gone to my hospital who did not believe in clinical trials. I'd say believe, but they didn't run clinical trials out of that hospital. They were a health maintenance organization and didn't deal with those things. So my option was, my doctor didn't know about clinical trials, gave me a website, which was clinicaltrials.gov. And it was a disaster for me as a patient. And I know that they're getting better at it and that there's work being done on it. But when I first started in this, it was years ago and it was confusing. And I think even now it's confusing with inclusions and exclusions and how things are written. And it's just hard to find these options. So I think we're getting better at it. I think there's a lot of companies, I know there's a lot of companies out there who are trying to make this a more positive experience. And I think that that's the way we need to go.
So I've got a question for you. You've said that clinical trials are seen as a last option for a lot of patients, and I've seen that too. How do we make them become the first option? Because if we think about like, what's the best science, what's the, it's clinical trials because it's at the forefront. So how do you think we can change that mindset of doctors and hospitals and patients that look at clinical trials first? And then if there's not something for you, go to standard of care.
I think involving the patient really, right? I mean, this is such a fascinating topic, but when you go to a doctor, you don't hear a lot of these things. You when you go in for a diagnosis, you get a diagnosis, you're given a treatment. There's, nobody really pushes a clinical trial as a first option. I think redefining it for patients and actually showing them that there is a bigger goal for these things and to show them that you are helping other people. I think that if we look at it as something that is that last ditch option, like most of us see, it does put a negative spin on this. And for you to come out talking about clinical trials, you doing it to help and to help with this vaccine, it gives a different viewpoint that I think people need to see.
Yeah. So Kelly, I think my view of that is, first of all, clearly clinical trials aren't appropriate for every patient, right? So there's plenty of indications where standard treatment is really good and, you don't need to really go down the clinical trial road. However, it depends how you define clinical trials. There's many non-interventional clinical trials, etc. I think what your question makes me think of is two things. One is, how do we intervene pre-disease? So as we develop treatments that may prevent disease versus you presenting, that's one. And the second one is, how do we integrate clinical research into clinical care? Lots of people talk about it, but the truth is that clinical trials up to now have been very siloed, right? They're not in the EHR, they're in life sciences. And there is financial incentives that mean that there's reasons why actually some groups will be discouraged from actually putting their patients in clinical trials due to financial incentives. So I think those are kind of more systemic issues that we need to think about to truly make clinical trials, one, integrated and where appropriate, early in that choice. That would be my view of it. Does that make sense, Kelly?
It does make sense. And your first point about finding and enrolling patients into clinical trials before they have disease manifestation reminds me of the Minority Report. So if we're talking about science fiction, you're like right on the money there. And I agree with you. We really do need to make it easier for everyone to understand if clinical trials are an option. And it's just that, an option. But if people don't know that they exist or they have these preconceived notions about them, then we're losing.
Yeah, absolutely. In all your experience, either you or Christine, are there other things that you think are obvious wins that we should be low-hanging fruit, that we should be really aiming at, that companies that do have good sort of customer sort of focus have been doing for years and we just aren't beginning to even touch in our world? Is there other things that one can think about?
We could play Name That Tune. I could probably come up with 50 of these things.
Okay.
But Christine, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I was just going to say we could bring back empathy. I think that we don't look at people as people anymore. And if we would just look at people as a person, it would change the perspective of everything.
Well, you bring up a great point, which is true for both healthcare and research, which is people talk about kind of clinician burnout, and it's really more about the system kind of burning them out as opposed to, and that does lead to a lot of lack of empathy. You're absolutely correct. I think that's a big problem that we have. Yeah, I like that. Okay.
And along those lines, we need to start talking about patients as patients or participants, not as subjects.
Yes.
I try to get everyone in any company that I've ever worked for to not use that term, and I have been 100% unsuccessful. Go ahead.
Kelly, I'm interested in that. I know some people feel very passionately about this. What have you heard when you've said, to the scientists, look, we think you should change this terminology? Can you remember what they've told you as kind of a response to that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So some say, "Oh, okay," and then they'll use participant until they go back to using subject because it's just like so ingrained in their brain.
Sure.
Others have said, "Well, no, they're part of a research experiment, so they're subjects. That's part of informed consent. It's part of GCP." And then I've explained that yes, informed consent, et cetera, they're still people, they're still individuals. They're not just data. Others have really made an effort, and then some people just ignore me.
Has anyone given you, apart from sort of GCP, have they given you any other concrete sort of reason why it should remain that way?
No, and we all know that that GCPs does not say you will always call individuals subjects.
I think where the tradition comes from was probably, I'm guessing, a desire to not communicate to people that they're getting treatment, that there was very clear this wasn't treatment, so you're not a patient, you're a subject because you're in an experiment, as your colleagues sort of put it. So I think that, I'm guessing that was where the background came, being very clear with people that this isn't your standard treatment, you must be very clear that this is experimental. I'm guessing that's where it's coming from, and that's been kind of the reluctance to change it. Christine, how do you feel about that going into clinical trials as a patient?
So it's funny because when I first got into it, I used to hear people refer to them not even as subjects, but as just the de-identified data. So you've come a long way in a couple of years. But again, I think it pulls away from the fact that you're a person when you call somebody a subject. And, it's a funny thing. I had talked to a researcher one time on a plane, and I thanked him for what he did. I said, I want to thank you for doing what you do, for working he was with a pharmaceutical company. And he said, why? All I do is stare at cells all day. And so I just thought right then, even him not knowing the impact of his job made it a little less personal.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I think just defining to everybody, that this isn't just a job for any of us. This is somebody's future. This is your children's future and how much that means.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know that we're going to be discussing so many other topics. So what I would encourage everyone watching is if you have thoughts about what aspects of patient experience we could explore further, we'd certainly at the Secretariat love to hear about this. We'll definitely give that to Christine and Kelly, and they both will be leading sort of this series of conversations. Is there anything else that you two want to mention in terms of what we've talked about before we wrap up this sort of beginning of this series?
Just a big thank you to everybody who's been involved in clinical research one way or another. Big thanks to you and to Christine, and really looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Kelly. Christine, do you have anything to finally end up with?
I do. Oh, yeah. I want to say thank you again to all of you. Thank you again, Kelly, for being involved in the trials. And I think we've come a long way from even just a few years ago, but we're not quite there yet. So I think just for people to keep in mind that patients are people too, and just keep that in the back of your head as you move forward and make these decisions and continue in these conversations during the summit.
Absolutely. I think one of the things I can say is that people who come to Summit tend to be people who are more likely to think that, right, than the average. So I'm very happy about that. Thank you both, and we'll be talking soon. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.